Hello and welcome to the Race and Rights podcast, hosted by the Rutgers Law Center for Security, Race and Rights, also known as CSRR. This is Dr. Isa Mohammed Septi Samara, licensed master social worker and faculty affiliate at CSRR. And today I have the pleasure of guest hosting this episode of the Race and Rights podcast in place of my colleague, Professor Sahar Aziz. The Race and Rights podcast explores the myriad issues that adversely impact the civil and human rights of America's diverse Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities, here as well as abroad. If you find the podcast informative, consider supporting it by making a donation at csrr.rutgers.edu and press the donate button. You can also follow CSRR on social media at Rutgers CSRR on Instagram and LinkedIn, and at RUCSRR on X and Facebook. Honored to be joined by a number of my colleagues who will introduce themselves in a moment, who are all social workers and researchers, and together we'll be discussing an urgent and underexamined issue in our profession, and that is anti-Palestinian, anti-Arab, and anti-Muslim racism. Before we get into it, I want to just give us a really brief scope of the issue. We're living through a moment where anti-Palestinian racism and anti-Arab racism are not only growing, but they're really taking dangerous root across our societies. In Canada, for example, a recent report from York's University Islamophobia Research Hub documented a sharp and dangerous rise in anti-Palestinian and anti-Arab racism after October 2023. And the Toronto Police reported a 1,600% spike in related hate crimes within just 6 weeks of October 7th, 2023. And across the country, people have lost jobs, were suspended from school, and faced harassment simply for voicing support for Palestinian rights. Some of my colleagues fit into that category. In the United States, the repression has been just as severe. Palestine Legal has recorded more than 1,800 incidents of censorship and intimidation of Palestinians and Palestine supporters since October 7th, 5 times more than all of 2022. And behind these numbers are devastating human stories. These aren't just statistics. The fatal stabbing of 6-year-old Palestinian American boy Wadi al-Fiyumi is a tragic example out of Illinois. The shooting of 3 Palestinian men in Burlington, Vermont, and the attempted drowning of a 3-year-old Palestinian girl in Texas. These aren't just statistics. These are real human stories. But as my guest scholarship makes clear, these realities aren't just simply the product of individual prejudice. They call instead for a systemic understanding of these racisms. Anti-Palestinian racism is deeply embedded in institutions, policies, and public discourse, they argue, and all of these intersect with anti-Muslim, anti-Arab, anti-Black, and other forms of oppression. And we'll get into all of those here in a bit. But what I would like today's conversation to do is push us past the framing of isolated hate and into deeper exploration of how this racism really shows up across interpersonal, structural, and institutional levels. We'll also confront difficult questions about social work's role. We're all social workers here, right? How has a profession that is supposed to be rooted in social justice failed to meet the moment? Why does silence, especially around Palestine and Palestinians, so often become the default? And what will it take? What will it take to break the silence and build a profession that truly lives up to its commitments of equity and justice? And then finally, we'll look at solutions. What does meaningful systemic action actually look like? How do we as social workers stand with impacted communities rather than speak for them? And what can each of us do to challenge complicity and work toward a future rooted in dignity, safety, and liberation for all? It's a hard but necessary conversation. I always tell my students, we can do hard things. And I can't think of better guests to help us navigate it. So with that, I'd like to open the floor. Siham, you're to my right, so I'll start there. If you want to go ahead and introduce yourselves to the audience, and then we'll go around.
Thanks for having me. So my name is Siham Al-Qasim. I am an assistant professor at the University of Windsor in the School of Social Work. Some of my areas of expertise is around anti-Muslim racism and other intersecting forms of oppression, and specifically the social, emotional, and psychological consequences. And having said that, that also is including different forms of anti-Palestinian racism and how that is experienced by Muslim youth, which has been the focus of my last 2 research studies. Very happy to be here.
Happy to have you. And then, Nuha, you are next up on my side.
Thank you. I am Nuha Dweikat Shaer. I am an assistant professor at Wilfrid Laurier University's Faculty of Social Work. As a Palestinian architect and social worker, my work is deeply informed by my people, the histories of dispossession and resistance. And I study how colonial systems operate through space, law, and education. and I collaborate with communities to co-create knowledge that advances spatial justice and challenges institutional complicity and reclaim social work as a practice of solidarity and transformation.
Excellent. I'm so excited to have you here. Thank you for being here. Amala?
Hi, thank you. So, by way of introduction, I'm a Canadian Muslim woman of Indo-Caribbean descent. I've been a social work educator for more than a decade, and I'm currently working on my PhD at Wilfrid Laurier University, where I'm also a lecturer within the Faculty of Social Work. My SSHRC-funded doctoral research explores the experiences of Muslim women educators, particularly as it relates to gendered Islamophobia and anti-Muslim racism within schools and faculties of social work. I'm also practicing social worker with a focus on clinical social work and community organizing at the intersections of race, faith, and mental health.
Awesome. Thank you so much for being here.
Hi, I'm Bryn King. I'm an associate professor at the Faculty of Social Work at the University of Toronto. I'm originally American, and while my name and my appearance indicate that I'm white, my family is also Syrian. So I sort of live in a dual identity in some ways where I'm Arab if I announce it, which I choose to do. My research focuses primarily on the child welfare system and young people involved in the child welfare system. And I've spent a lot of my research trying to understand sort of the impacts of the child welfare system on young people, their trajectories, outcomes, experiences, both at the front door and as they leave the system. But more recently, I'm increasingly interested in the ways that sort of colonialized and racialized logic exist within the structure of the system as operationalized by policies, procedures, practices, sort of standards that become the very fabric of the way these institutions work. And so that has been a big focus of my research recently.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for being here. And Bryn, you and I have that in common of focusing on the child welfare system. And it's interesting. So as everyone was introducing themselves, I want to just point out that one of the goals of this conversation is to center Palestinian, Arab, and Muslim voices because, and we'll get into this right now, all of these are relevant to what we're talking about today. And so I want us to just start out, I routed off a bunch of concepts at the beginning, and I want to make sure that I don't lose anyone. So let's start out with just some basic concepts for the folks at home. And Siham, I'm looking right at you because your recent paper really spells this out for us. So if you could give us just kind of a functional definition of what it is that I'm referring to when I say anti-Palestinian racism, anti-Arab racism, and anti-Muslim racism.
Okay, so thank you for, in your introduction, I think you did a great job in naming the sort of reality, the context, and the scope so clearly in terms of these different forms of racism. And I often say that other scholars do a really good job at illustrating the fact that anti-Arab, anti-Muslim, and anti-Palestinian racism are linked, but also distinct. So we'll start with anti-Muslim racism. It's essentially how people who are Muslim or perceived to be Muslim are racialized or treated as a risky or inferior group, right? And so it's not just about a personal belief or an ideology, thoughts, a feeling of hate or discomfort with Muslims or Islam. It's about how, with people, how names, skin tone, hijab, your beard, your accent, your dress get read as Muslim and then policed or harmed. So anti-Arab racism targets people who are Arab, again, often through language, name, or appearance, treating them as foreign, uncivil, or suspect. Anti-Palestinian racism is very specific. It's a form of racism that erases, it silences, it punishes Palestinian identity, narratives. It shows up in denial in the indigeneity of the Palestinian or Palestinians in general, genocide denial, Nakba denial, Naksa denial, double standards, censorship, repression of Palestinian activism, which we've seen has been very prevalent across academic spaces in the United States and Canada and other places across the globe. Dehumanization. And the idea, I think, that Palestinian life or people or life in general is less grievable or they're less worthy of rights and human rights, essentially. There's been some really excellent articles and publications that have come out, probably over the last 15 to 20 years around this form of racism specifically. So I think the one message that I'd like to really sort of send to folks who are listening in, that it's important to understand that these are not only forms of interpersonal racism or hate or bias or whatever it is you want to call it. I think bias is a little too soft. They're produced and sustained by systems, media frames, school discipline, securitization and surveillance priorities that we saw, post 9/11, anti-terror laws in Canada, Patriot Act, Muslim ban. There's so many things that we can list. Bill C-21, which is essentially a hijab ban in Quebec. Some of the biometric requirements for folks coming from Gaza. We'll talk about that later in the episode. And so these are examples of state-sanctioned forms of anti-Muslim, Arab, and Palestinian racism.
Wow. I went to you because I knew you would be able to break it down. And I really love what you said, linked but distinct. And I heard you for the first time use that terminology, the first time I heard it anyway, at CSWE conference back in, I think it was 2024. And I really like that. And I want to just touch on something. Often I hear the term Islamophobia thrown around, whether it's in the media, with colleagues, or even in papers. I've read the term, and I hear it a lot. But in your work, you really challenge that view, and you try to pull it out. And so tell me more about the distinction between what you're talking about of these linked but distinct forms of racism, anti-Palestinian, anti-Arab, anti-Muslim racism, how they're not just individual bias, right? They're part of a system. Tell me more about the distinction between that and Islamophobia as we've understood it for such a long time.
Yeah, so when I say they're linked but distinct, I think it's also to highlight the fact that, for example, anti-Palestinian racism is a form of Arab racism. And so you will see, unfortunately, that in other Muslim majority countries and even some Gulf Coast countries where there are certain things that are happening that illustrate forms of anti-Palestinian racism. And just anecdotally, what I've heard from friends and colleagues and folks who travel to those regions of the world where any Palestine solidarity or activism is also censored and suppressed. So then that is an example of how, lateral violence occurs even from one Arab to another Arab. Anti-Palestinian racism also is intensified by Orientalist tropes and stereotypes that are very much rooted in anti-Muslim racism. So it's, again, really important to link them, but also make sure that we recognize they are distinct. Now, the term Islamophobia, so I use it in my article and I use it in my dissertation, and I'm in my writings currently not wanting to use it. And so in the article that I published in Intersectionalities Beyond Hate, I use the term Islamophobia to describe ideas and narratives. So sort of like fear, suspicion, stereotype about Islam, that you see in discourse, particularly in media and politics. But I have to say that I use the term Islamophobia just begrudgingly. Really, I do. And so the phobia framing for me, as a clinician, leans on clinical language that can slide into sanist sort of implications. Okay. And so that as if to say prejudice, Orientalism, coloniality, white supremacy, which is all foundational to anti-Muslim racism, are mental health concerns or a mental health condition. While also watering down the intensity of racism. So this isn't a fear to be treated, it's racism and colonial violence to be dismantled. And so for social workers especially, our language should avoid medicalizing prejudice and should name power and accountability. And that's why I emphasize anti-Muslim racism and the use of anti-Muslim racism. So anti-Muslim racism is how those ideas, right? Those ideologies, those stereotypes, those tropes that are racist and harmful get materialized in people's lives, via surveillance, restriction, employment barriers, unequal access to, a number of things. So I push back on treating this as an individual moral failing. And of course, personal prejudice matters, but the real engine is multi-layered and multi-level. So as I, outlined in the article, anti-Muslim racism occurs intra and interpersonally. So intra meaning it starts with the way that a person thinks, and then it can manifest interpersonally between people. So internalized stereotypes and racism and Orientalist beliefs, they translate into everyday microaggressions. Like, do you shower with your hijab on? They're so articulate, right? Into other forms of really nasty things like pulling off a person's hijab, harassment on transit. These are all things that came up in my research. To structural forms of anti-Muslim racism, like, workplace neutrality around rules that deny prayer or prayer time or prayer space, hiring screens, right? Islamophobia in hiring practices or anti-Muslim racism in hiring practices, and then institutional anti-Muslim racism, which I've outlined earlier. So again, really needing to understand that the multi-level, the layers to anti-Muslim racism, interpersonal, structural, and institutional. So if we only focus on hate incidents, then we miss where the volume of harm lives. So job calls that, that never come, funding that never arrives. I mean, for me, right, like just applying for shirks and things like that right now, like there's some questions around, when you get those rejections, whether or not it has to do with your focus on anti-Muslim racism and anti-Palestinian racism. So
yeah, I'm glad you brought that up to share some of my overlapping identities, right? I'm half Palestinian, half English. I'm also Muslim. The listeners could have guessed that by my name, to your point of being identifiable in name, in look, and in other ways. But I'm glad you distinguished Islamophobia, and I can empathize with your kind of resentment towards the term. As a kid growing up in the early 2000s, I can remember thinking to myself, like, we're afraid of spiders, like arachnophobia or claustrophobia. I'm not something to be afraid of, and just trying to name it for the purpose of accountability, right? This isn't an illness that needs to be treated, or just to put a more finer point on it, and that it's something that needs to be dismantled. I appreciate that structure, and yet it's still a term that's used often in our discourse, and so it comes up often. I also want to touch on something as well, because, and we're talking in a social work space, we're always focusing on intersectionality and overlapping. Here is the intersection of different types of racisms and harm. And so I mentioned really quickly about, how these different types of racism, anti-Palestinian, anti-Arab, anti-Muslim racism, they overlap with other forms of oppression, like anti-Black racism, anti-trans racism, all those different, or anti-trans oppression. And Bryn, I see your hand up. I'll send this over to you. I'm curious, how does this emphasize, or how can we emphasize the overlap there?
Before we do that, I just want to, because you were going on this train that I wanted to just pick up on, which was around the phobia piece of Islamophobia. And when we've had some of our dialogues around it, like one of the things that really struck me in those conversations is the way that framing legitimizes fear. And this is the thing that is so inherent to Islamophobia, or the way that anti-Muslim racism has been operationalized in the context of Muslims, Arabs, Palestinians are all terrorists and are meant to be feared, right? And so this idea that Islamophobia is the term that we use for it legitimizes that fear, and then it's just like people who practice Islam are actually scary. And so I think that was such a key piece of when we were in these dialogues, Siham, that I was like really pulling from. And then you started to talk about it, Isa, like this idea of like, I'm afraid of spiders, like I'm afraid of Muslims, like it's all legitimized as something worthy to be afraid of, rather than an actual structural problem around racism that does share commonalities with other forms of racism. And maybe Siham, you want to, because you probably were more prepared for this, but I can also talk about it.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point. I think, Bryn, honestly, like I really do want to eradicate this term, but the problem is it's adopted and used. I think this requires some more conversation around the harm of, and almost as, I don't know, that this sort of almost like, I wonder, it's like a colonial conceptualization of racism that is super insidious, right? Yeah, thank you for that really, really important point around the legitimization of fear of Muslims and Islam, and really us sort of, I feel a sense of like I'm perpetuating that as I'm writing papers or using the term in my own work and research. So thank you for that.
It's tough. And I think, Bryn, I often think about it as like a permission framework, right? We're giving a framework for the permissibility of this. It's just normal. It's normative. I'm just a little afraid. It's just there. And I think in speaking with my colleagues and reading their work around other forms of racism, right? When we talk about anti-Black racism or other forms of oppression, it comes up there as well, right? Where it's kind of in the culture. And so I think that's a perfect pivot for us to talk about, well, when we're talking about anti-Muslim, anti-Palestinian, and anti-Arab racism, this is not just an isolated incident, right? This is systemic, and it's, to use your term, Siam, it's linked but distinct from other forms of racism, right?
It is. And speaking to intersectionality, and I have to just say this as a critical race and anti-colonial theorist, again, we may talk about this later on in the episode, the way that intersectionality is misused. Is not theorized through race and gender the way Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw and other critical race theorists, meant it to be used. So what I'd like to say is anti-Muslim racism does not land on a blank slate. It does not land on a blank slate. It intersects with other power relations. So in my research and a lot of the research that's out there, Black Muslims, face anti-Blackness, anti-Muslim racism, over surveillance, harsher discipline, barriers to housing and work in the United States and in Canada. South Asian, West Asian Muslims experience anti-Brown, anti-Arab racism layered with Muslim racialization. Muslim women, gendered anti-Muslim racism is also layered. And I'll let Amla speak more to that. That is her area of expertise. For folks who identify as queer or from choice LGBTQIA, backgrounds are encountering, exclusion in queer spaces via anti-Muslim racism, and then in Muslim spaces are also experiencing a lot of harm. And and I hate to use the term homophobia and transphobia here because it also lends to the same sort of flavor as the term homophobia, right? But for those folks, this is sort of a double marginalization and barriers to care, and feeling a sense of belonging anywhere for that matter. And then newcomers, immigrants also, meet anti-Muslim racism at the intersection of xenophobia, and then also if they're coming from other ethnic or cultural backgrounds. And so one of the things that I talk about in Beyond Hate is this understanding that one's proximity to whiteness really matters in terms of the intensity their experiences with anti-Muslim racism. And so that means that, lighter skin, anglicized names, not wearing a hijab, for example, can reduce your exposure to those sorts of harms. Darker skin, accented English, religious dress can increase it. Again, I want to plug it in here for social work. Intersectionality isn't supposed to be a buzzword or a sign posting for reflecting on one social location. The design requirement that should center a race and gendered analysis. So that's also really important to note.
Yeah, Alma, I saw you nodding your head, and I know that gendered anti-Muslim racism that's your wheelhouse. So what would you like to add?
I was under the impression that we were sticking to a script. Okay. We'll cut this out. I think what Siham said around intersectionality as sort of being reduced to a buzzword is very important for us to think about. And also the misunderstanding that it is, somehow about oppression Olympics, and the more boxes you tick off, the more oppressed you are. But what people fail to understand, and this has significant policy implications, is that intersectionality is about how layers of oppression impact and change the experiences of oppression in other categories. So if we take the example of the interaction of being visibly Muslim and being a woman, then you have the experience of what Jasmine Zine termed gendered Islamophobia. And I know we're kind of being critical of this term, but I will use it out of respect for Jasmine's framing of this issue, which she does a marvelous job of showing how Islamophobia is experienced differently by those who are assigned female or are cisgender women because of the gender identity that we have. So whether this is being visibly marked by hijab, which is significant, but expands beyond that to think about how does safety and securitization operate differently for men versus women at the intersection of being Muslim. And Siham also mentioned anti-Black racism, which was, very well documented in Alberta, that Somali Muslim women were being targeted in very different ways than Muslims from other ethnic minority communities. So I think it is important to note that this has really important policy implications, and it's not just a term we can use to enhance theorizing. But, as a social worker, I'm always concerned about what are we doing with this information?
Yeah. Bryn, go for it. I see you want to jump in there.
I just wanted to sort of add to the way that this idea of intersectionality gets operationalized in social work, which is, yes, like the oppression Olympics. Like if I have one, it's like adverse childhood events, like let me just like scale it up. But it also presumes that each form of oppression or marginalization is equal, right? And this is where we get into these ideas, and we'll talk more about this later, that like all oppression sort of exist in like this, like, if you have one, it's transferable or it's, replaceable with another because the harms are equivalent, right? And the challenges are equivalent. And I think we see this a lot. I see this a lot in social work of really like, oh, well, like whose safety gets prioritized, right? Because we are all kind of supposed to be equal and our marginalization is equal. And I think that's actually very dangerous terrain because of the ways in which racism is not just interpersonal, it's structural, right? And the ways that it shapes access, exclusion, experiences of, harm that are visible, not visible, that have like really significant impacts on life course rather than just I'm uncomfortable here because people aren't speaking to my experiences in ways that feel safe.
Right, absolutely. And this keeps coming up, right? This keeps coming up that it's systemic. This isn't just a one-off. This isn't an anomaly. This isn't individual. It's not just interpersonal. And so at the top of the episode, I mentioned some staggering statistics about anti-Palestinian racism. But I wanted to point out, because all four of y'all are in Canada, and Canada holds the highest rate of targeted killings of Muslims among G7 nations. And that's according to a committee commissioned by the Canadian Parliament in 2024 on, funny enough, Islamophobia and anti-Semitism. And the report indicated that more Muslims have been killed in targeted attacks in Canada in the past 7 years than in any other G7 country. And in the US, the number of reported hate crimes targeting Muslims and Palestinians obviously have also increased precipitously, as I described earlier. One statistic that I often reflect on, it comes out of the Council on American Islamic Relations, who in March 2025 indicated that there were 8,658 complaints regarding anti-Muslim and anti-Arab incidents received by the organization, which is the highest since they started collecting the data in the late 90s. And of course, again, these are real stories, right? These are, I mentioned Wadi al-Fayumi, the little boy, the 6-year-old who was stabbed to death in front of his mother, right? Or the little girl with the attempted drowning in Texas. All of these really hit and they strike. I can speak for myself as a Muslim, as a Palestinian, as a father. They strike fear in a way that is really challenging to describe. But because, and I want to go back to this point, because this is systemic, right? This is what we're arguing. This is systemic. What have our systems done, right? How would we characterize the overall response to this systemic rise in anti-Palestinian, anti-Arab, and anti-Muslim racism in both Canada and the United States? And I'll leave this to anybody. What, if anything, has been done?
I'd like to jump in there and thank you for the framing. Really important to note all the statistics and what we know, especially where we're at right now with the rise of anti-Palestinian racism. And for me, looking at what's happening or what's not happening in Canada and the U.S. is so important. I'm also American and I'm Palestinian. So, this is not just about my research. This is a very personal thing. So when we look at the numbers and the human stories behind them, the overall response has been, frankly, one of systemic inaction in Canada, mostly wrapped in like symbolic language. So governments, institutions, even our own professional social work tend to respond to this violence with statements of condemnation or moments of sympathy, but not with any real sort of structural change that's needed to actually protect people or shift systems. We've seen a pattern of reactivity without any accountability. Vigils, commemorations, new task forces, okay, they're good, but very little that disrupts the root causes. The policies, surveillance structures, the political rhetoric that make Muslims, Arabs, Palestinians perpetually suspect, it's all still there. And so across both Canada and the US, we've seen selective empathy at play. When Muslims or Palestinians are targeted, the response is often depoliticized, framed as like isolated hate, not as a predictable outcome of how our societies have racialized and securitized Muslims and Arab identities and now Palestinians. Again, and then that's happened for as long as I could remember, being a Palestinian child growing up in Chicago and just, experiencing interpersonal anti-Palestinian racism. So while individual acts of hatred are often condemned, state and institutional policies that reproduce the same logic of harm remain intact. In social work, and this speaks to our article and several other articles that came out in the Abolitionist Journal, the silence is especially troubling because we call ourselves a social justice profession. And, you said that quite beautifully in the intro. Yet too often, I want to say our codes of ethics are more aspirational and not at all operational. And so we have to name the silence as complicity. And I think we did that, and many, many other people are doing that as well.
One thing in particular stood out to me there, reactivity. So the notion that we are reacting and more or less ignoring that this is and you use the words predictable, that this is a predictable outcome of what we're putting into our society. These structured forms of racism not only have been allowed to exist, they've been allowed to flourish. And it becomes personal because research is me search, right? As a Muslim, as a Palestinian, as an Arab, but also as a social worker. And I want to just immediately jump into that. We've talked about from a societal standpoint, but let's focus in on where you ended there, Siham, on the social work side of things, because you talk about, and you don't mince words in your paper, you talk specifically about the commitment to social justice that social work claims. But the profession has really failed to effectively address anti-Palestinian racism. And also, newsflash to those who don't know this already, has a legacy of racism anyway. There's this kind of culture of exceptionalism that I find in my classroom often. It's like, social work's always been around and we've always had this, these lofty ethics and we've always been on the right side of history. Not true. We can give some very poignant examples from both the US and Canadian context. And so I want to pitch this to you. When we talk about our commitment to social justice and our failure, what comes up for you?
Well, I think that, when we think about our regulatory bodies, the phrase that came to mind as Siham was talking was the quote unquote thoughts and prayers language, that social work is very good at this very superficial commentary. But even in this conversation now, in this moment now around Palestine, even that superficial commentary is absent. Even those, somewhat empty statements of support, we don't see them actually. And when we do see them, there's a false equation of, this genocide as conflict or as war, or this, minimization of Palestinian suffering or outright dehumanization. So, before we get into that, I think it's important to note that we do actually have many explicit commitments to social justice. So in the Canadian context, you have the Canadian Association of Social Workers. The Code of Ethics specifically says, respecting dignity and worth of all people, promoting social justice, pursuing truth and reconciliation, explicit commitments to anti-oppression and addressing racism and discrimination. In Ontario, which is where the four of us are all based, our College of Social Workers also has a code of ethics that explicitly calls us to advocate for social justice. And they define social justice as, quote unquote, an ideal condition in which all members of society have the same basic rights, protection, opportunities, obligations, and social benefits. And implicit in this concept is the notion that historical inequalities be acknowledged and remedied through specific measures. So again, you have this context that calls for, these principles and values that call for structural and systemic analysis and change, but don't do much. And then in the American context, you have the National Association of Social Workers, which does the same thing, outlines an ethical responsibility related to social and political action. And these values and ethical principles are what we often cite as our differentiating quality, right? When we compare ourselves to other helping professions, this is often what draws our students to social work, as opposed to psychology or other, counseling related disciplines. This stated commitment to understanding and intervening in the social environment, in the political arena, as opposed to viewing these concerns as solely an individual level or a family or group level.
Right. Yeah, precisely. And the respecting the dignity and worth of all people in the NASW here in the United States in our Code of Ethics. What's interesting, pursuing truth and reconciliation. And we've had this conversation, we've been kind of skirting around it a bit. How can you pursue truth and reconciliation when folks aren't even willing to say the truth, right? When we talk about naming the genocide, when we talk about naming what anti-Palestinian racism is, anti-Muslim racism is, we're using such sanitized language here. Mm-hmm. So what would it look like we're arguing that social work has failed to address anti-Palestinian racism, anti-Muslim racism, anti-Arab racism. And there are, and you alluded to this, Amala, there are some statements that have been put out, some position statements, often under pressure after protest, right? After pressure from social workers and researchers and a number of other folks in the community. What would it look like? And Nuha, I want to bring you into this conversation because we haven't heard from you yet. What does it look like to confront anti-Palestinian, anti-Muslim, and anti-Arab racism?
Thank you for bringing me in after all the silence. Speaking to what Amila was saying, in like social work silence on the genocide in Palestine, it's a form of hypocrisy. And it creates a crisis of identity for practitioners who see the field, as selective in terms of which causes to stand for and which causes to leave out. So this silence, it actually exposed a profound gap between what the profession claims to do and what they are doing on the ground, leading to what, as I mentioned, to the crisis in the identity of social workers, like operationalizing the ethics and values that they learn about. Also here, I would like our work, we argued that, claiming that neutrality, particularly in relation to the Palestinian cause, by itself is violence. So this profession that claims that it's there to address violence and injustice, it's by itself become embodying and by this neutrality being violent toward, Arab, Muslim, Palestinians, and everyone who's impacted by this cause and the whole humanity. Actually, it's not only a Palestinian Arab Muslim issue. This thing, it's a humanity issue. We argue in our work that neutrality in face of genocide is not passive. It's an active alignment with the oppressor and gives legitimacy to the oppressor when we claim neutrality within this profession. Also, the other thing I would like to talk about it in terms, because since you mentioned also the truth and reconciliation, it's the profession complicity in settler colonialism. So again, it's similar, if I want just to make this comparison with the indigenous people in Canada, and even what happened to them, we don't name it genocide, the millions who've been killed by the white settlers, by not naming genocide either for indigenous people or genocide in Palestine. The profession is complicit in settler colonialism. It's complicit in the erasure of the Palestinian suffering. It's complicit, silencing Palestinians, either students or scholars, and also the practitioners when they want to respond what's happening in Palestine. So that's clear how the profession is complicit in settler colonialism, even though they claim that, we have, they celebrate reformative, maybe let's say, they celebrate, for example, the red dress, the orange shirt day, which is a truth and reconciliation. So they celebrate these things, but without real action to change reality. Similarly, in Palestine, by silencing, not welcoming the narrative related to Palestine, and by not advocating for justice in Palestine, similar to what they do in other causes, they here also complicit, and they promote settler colonialism and the erasure of indigenous people and their narratives. So that's in terms of this.
Right. And you brought up so many good points there. And it kind of, as you were speaking, I was thinking about the way it mirrors what's happening in the broader social context with policy, right? Siam and I were having this back and forth earlier talking about, well, there are some examples of, the Canadian government reacting to different forms of anti-Palestinian, anti-Muslim, anti-Arab racism. The thing that comes to mind is the murder of the Afzal family in 2020 or 2021, and the National Summit on Islamophobia, to use that term again, that followed that, right? But nothing actually came of that work in a tangible policy way, right? And similarly, when we pivot to social work, and I like how you said identity crisis, because it's come up for me as a social worker, it's come up for my students many times, where neutrality is an active choice here, it's not neutral. Neutral is misleading. Neutrality is violence, as you said. And it's funny that you connect this to a human issue, because what's interesting now here in the United States context, now that a number of anti-DEI bills have been passed, very similar in their structure to anti-Palestinian bills that have been passed in previous years, predating 2023, just to make that clear. Now folks are saying, whoa, this feels different. And yet there's this history of complicity and what I always like to call the Palestine exception. But Siham, to your very early point of, when we hear that silence, when we don't get the callback, when we don't get the grant, what is actually happening there? And to me, it often lands on the Palestine exception, right? And how this is just a continuation of really the complicity of the social work profession, how you brought up the indigenous population, right? How have you all dealt with this identity crisis in social work?
So this is an example of how we're dealing with it in social work. And I think, in the 2 papers that we've written, one is that we finished. We are writing multiple papers, but one is already published, one we're sort of waiting to hear about. Like, one of the things that I think is sort of first and foremost in our plan of action is the refusal, right? And like engaging in this dialogue, writing these papers, speaking, is this refusal to this pressure for silence. And I guess would you like me to sort of move into the phenomenologies piece around? Yeah.
Can I read you an excerpt from your paper?
Yeah.
So this is in your forthcoming paper, right? It has not been published yet, or this was...
Which paper is it?
This was, Phenomenologies of Silence. This is now published.
Yes.
Yeah, this is now published in the Abolitionist Journal, correct? For those of you listening at home, hopefully we can link this, but if we can't, go ahead and look that up. But I'm going to read a brief quote for you here. And I quote, "In social work specifically, institutional discourses of neutrality and universalism further enforce silence, framing advocacy for Palestinian liberation as quote-unquote biased or too political. The silence is compounded by what Aziz and Plitnick describe as the deployment of Islamophobic tropes, particularly the presumption of anti-Semitism to discredit Palestinian voices and deflect critiques of Israeli settler colonialism. This conflation of Palestine advocacy with anti-Semitism not only silences critique, but also undermines efforts to meaningfully address anti-Semitism. Together, these forces shape a professional climate where silence is not passive, it is produced, policed, and deeply felt." And Bryn, you started talking about this pressure, right? How, and I say this knowing for me what it's like to navigate the pressure to stay silent, right? Mm-hmm. The implicit and explicit statements here and there. How are you navigating this?
Oh, I don't know. That is the forever question, right? And at some point we'll sort of come back, and I think it's important to kind of come back to maybe talking about how it started, but I'm going to just talk a little bit about the sort of the way that we've experienced it, and also the way that we're navigating it, right? And so you spoke to the Palestine exception, right, as being sort of central to kind of this fundamental contradiction of existing in social work. And yet, and we sort of made the automatic shift into the genocide, because much of the stuff that we were talking about sort of existed pre-October 2023, right? Like many of these sort of structural dynamics are around anti-Muslim racism, anti-Arab racism, and anti-Palestinian racism, and the Palestine exception all were in existence. And of course, like the events of October 2023 and everything has happened since then has sort of exposed them in the way that COVID exposed all of these like structural issues around access to healthcare. It's just ripped the Band-Aid off, and we are in the midst of, forgive you all will laugh, like weeping wounds, right? Like it has, these are just like all of this stuff that has been hidden, except for those who are directly and repeatedly impacted by it in their own professional careers and their own livelihoods. The world is sort of woken up to this. But in our context, we talk about sort of in the context of social work, we talk about the silence as operating in terms of the unwillingness to speak, right? Like there is an unwillingness to say what is happening. When we say what's happening, it's sort of held in this language around conflict and two sides. And, our hearts go out to our Jewish and Israeli colleagues and our although for the first time in October of 2023, I saw Palestine written in an official communication by my university, and I was like deeply shocked. Like I just never, how consistent it was that you could not even invoke the word in public spaces, that it was written by the president of the university. I was sort of like shocked about it. But in general, I won't go down that rabbit hole, but in general, there was like just a silence around it. And the silence at least in my faculty, and I know it's true for my colleagues here, was so profound that it was like noisy in and of itself. In some ways, like I compare it to like the sound of a drone, right? It's not accidental where how I spend the last 2 years listening to people who are under constant bombardment and hearing that like background sound. The silence was extraordinarily loud, right? And that silence then created another set of pressures around being silent and the sort of implied threat to your career, to your livelihood, to your reputation if you breach this kind of silence. And in the academic context, there was an illusion that there's academic freedom. And certainly in my university, we were under censure from several years before. In 2021, the Canadian Association of University Teachers censured my university for withdrawing an offer to a scholar to lead at the law school, the Center on like Human Rights, because she had written about Palestinian human rights. So that offer was withdrawn. The university was under censure. So there's a very clear sort of position of the university that you can talk about it, but there's no talking about it, right? Like it's actually not happening. There's silence, and then this sort of ongoing pressure to be silent while we live in an illusion that you have academic freedom. So you're navigating this space where you're living in two worlds, where people are acting like things are normal, that we can't talk about it because, it's not safe. It makes people uncomfortable, but you can talk about it if you want to. And meanwhile, we're watching, feeling, experiencing what's happening in Gaza for multiple years. And then I'll just say, so there's silence because of the Palestine exception, even though we'd been in places and spaces where we're all expected to advocate and indeed cheered for solidarity in other social justice movements, right? Oh, good job. Like, good that you can like advocate. We advocate for everybody. But here, again, absolute silence, an expectation of ongoing silence. And then when you breach the silence, because in truth, navigating a space, when you ask about navigation, it's intolerable. It's intolerable to be in a space where you cannot speak about the thing that is on your mind like a drone all of the time, right? And when you are watching and, we have people who are like directly impacted, in our, not necessarily me, but in our collective, in our families, right? To pretend that that's not happening, that is not the background or the foreground of our life on a daily basis. It's impossible to stand in these institutional spaces and to remain silent. And so there is an impact, and there are consequences which look like, punishment, surveillance, policing, assumptions that we're, unprofessional, that are then tied to these larger sort of tropes around AMR, AAR, and APR. There is an expectation. I'm going to come back to like the other form of silence later, but I kind of want to, I'll put a pin in it there. The way we navigate it is, again, through refusal, but maybe I'll come back to the other piece around neutrality later.
Yeah, I resonate a lot with the idea of this silence that is so loud, it's unbearable. This deafening silence. And Nuha, I see your head nodding, and I wanted to open up to you because I want to get your response to those folks who say, I just want to remain neutral. It's a complex issue. I want to remain neutral because at the beginning, when you introduce yourself, you talked about your own lived experience, right? There are a number of us here who are Palestinian. We have a number of shared identities. I know you do as well. And so when it comes to Palestine and Palestinians and affirming equal rights for all, and instead you are told, I'm going to stay neutral. How do you respond to that?
This is like even me now thinking like of people who say, or people responding to the suffering and oppression of Palestinian people. It's very difficult because like for me, I don't get it, how people see, thousands of children being killed, like bombarded by the most sophisticated weapons, and they have nothing to defend themselves and stay neutral. So it just blows my head how people are blind or chose to be blind. And I will focus on choosing to be blind because everything is out there, and whoever wants to see and choose to see, it's not hard to find it and see it. And also blows my mind when you see an image like very, very, like you see it in your eyes, and then you say, I want to be neutral. How come? or you want to have like a neutral party to talk about it or explain it. And you don't believe what you see in your eyes in this image. So for me, it's very hard to accept that and live with it. I moved to Canada in 2012. So I lived all my life in Nablus in Palestine. And as I told my colleagues in our conversations, I experienced different kind or forms of Zionist Israeli violence on the hands of the army, on the hands of the soldiers. So I experienced all of that. I don't want to romanticize it, but you feel, it makes you stronger in a way that you want to challenge it. You want, okay, let them beat me. I don't care. I want to continue, which is like we name it as like the Sumud concept, which we will talk about it maybe later. But like that violence, it's hard, it's painful. But when you come to see this form of violence here within the Western society, it crushes your soul, it crushes the soul. How come you want to be neutral in face of such atrocities, And even when the genocide started in October 2023, yes, I'm not surprised by the Israelis, like Zionist violence toward the Palestinians, because this is not new. It's been just exposed on this scale. It started like 100 years ago. And what happened it was a normal result to the many years of oppression when the Palestinians, fighting for their rights. And the response from the Israelis all the time, it's been very, massive. Like the numbers of Palestinians that they kill all the time being very big numbers. What I want to say here is when I came to the West and I started to see how the media reported, that even crushed me more, to be honest, than seeing the bombardment of Gaza and the attacks on the West Bank. I couldn't just what's going on? These people don't have eyes to see the pictures or the images coming. Don't listen from us as we are biased, but look at the images. You will tell who's the oppressor here. So for me, the impact of this neutrality, it crushes the soul. However, I could say as a group, we succeeded to build this small community through which we're able to understand our pain, to tell our story without reliving the trauma again. So if that makes sense to you. So finding this group that validate how I feel and not claim to be neutral, because wherever you go, people are claiming to be neutral. So that helped sustain my ability to continue or to keep going. Because back home, when you are faced by the oppression from the Israelis, it impacts the whole society. So your society is around you. We sustain each other. We hold each other to stay strong. However, when you are here and on Turtle Island, you're alone. So it's just very hard to sustain yourself unless you find your people, your community, who are able to see and validate your feelings and your experience. And they try to, they live it with you.
Thank you for sharing that perspective. And it is the idea of being unified in the face of clear oppression versus being isolated in the face of, I'm struggling to think of a better word than gaslighting, right? This idea of, being in a space where it is so obvious, especially for those of us in this conversation, right? Especially you, Nuhad, being from Nablus, which for those of you who don't know is a beautiful place in Palestine, Philistine, very famous for their cheese, Nablusi cheese. I was grilling with my father just this past weekend. It was his birthday, and so he requested some Nablusi cheese, which is part of the beauty of being Palestinian and of Palestine that we don't often get to talk about, right? Because we're so often talking about this, right? The oppression, the censure, the silence. I mean, you hit the nail on the head, soul crushing, to be in communities where folks are just saying, no, I care about you. I care about everyone. And yet around every corner being silenced. And Bryn, I want to go back to something that you put a pin in, and you're kind of laughing when you said this, the weeping wounds, and how you said this isn't new. It's just exposed at a greater scale. It's always been that the number of Palestinians killed, maimed, imprisoned, it's always been astronomical. Just people haven't been paying attention. And Bryn, you said the exact same thing when you said, well, the Band-Aid's been lifted off and our weeping wounds are exposed. And I'd be remiss if I pass up on this opportunity to talk about a term that you all coined, I believe, weepy universalism, because I love it so much. It encapsulates so much. If you could just really briefly give us
Give us an understanding. What do you mean when you talk about weepy universalism? Because Nuha, I think you were talking about it here.
Yeah. I feel ridiculous. I wrote it, that little part in there, but like, I also just want to say, this is either Siham's brilliance or our collective kind of dialogue. So let me just be clear, we had, and I know we, like you said, to be quick, but I just want to say that we kind of came together in accidental ways in order to write that first paper, The Phenomenologies of Silence. And I think what we found was far more than a paper, was this, Nuha says it with the kind of emotion that I'm not very good at bringing into everyday conversation, but what, like a sisterhood that has allowed us to be in this work, to be here in this moment, being willing to speak publicly in this way, because we know we have each other. I think that's been really important. And so we worked on this paper, but we were still in these dialogues. And as we were in these dialogues, sort of a call for papers came out, which just, the sort of the humor and the horror and the rage and the grief exist simultaneously for us in our conversations, right? So we're laughing and we're crying and we're raging and we're thinking and we're writing. It's a pretty organic process, but I always feel like this both came from the call, which, I don't care. I'm going to, I'm already exposed anyway. So, because this is where you'll see where the weepy universalism comes from. So the call was when the eyes become the organ for weeping and not foreseeing, social workers witnessing global violence. So we literally spent an hour screaming about this specific call and all of the language in it. And out of this emerged what we call the weepy paper, in which we have this concept, we've articulated this concept of weepy universalism, which is exactly what exists in that title, this emotionally laden, strongly affective language that performs solidarity, performs empathy, but does nothing to speak to the specificity of what is happening. So, and this happened, so we talk about being in a space of silence. We also have these off the side conversations with people who are like, oh yeah, this is terrible. What's happening? I'm so upset. Right. But their unwillingness, their sort of speech and performance around this is a terrible thing. But what is the terrible thing? What do we call it? What words does it have? Who's suffering? Who's causing the pain? All of this goes unnamed. So it's heavily emotional with no specificity, no clarity, and no naming of what the harm is or where it comes from. And we were sort of riffing off of that and sort of talking about it as this idea that suffering is sort of universal and it's weepy, and then this weepy universalism. So we did a search, right? Has anybody talked about this? And so the one place that I found it was in a review of a book about sort of the response to the Holocaust among Jewish scholars. And it is this idea that, we're going to just sort of talk about the universality of violence or the human condition in ways that allow us to remain neutral and yet seeming like we're taking a position about the impact of this kind of vague violence. I don't know, Siham, you want to add anything to that? Because I know this is so your jam.
No, I think you did a wonderful job. I think also speaking to the original article where you located the use of the term weepy, highlighting the importance of, in that argument, it was the need to actually speak and say that, the Holocaust was this devastating event. It was a genocide, and using framings that are harmful, not speaking to the specificity of that. And I think we sort of riffed off of that and used the Palestine exception as an example of that happening again, and having very specifically in that call to paper, framing it as a form of global violence. You're reading the call and you're like, I think they're talking about Gaza and Palestine and the genocide, but they're not explicitly saying it. And this is sort of a form in social work of complicit compassion, where they're, maybe they're getting the props and the check marks for saying a thing, but also not saying a thing at all. So I don't know. I hope I framed that properly, but you'll have to read the paper, everyone, when it comes out. Fingers crossed it's accepted. But it's for us, I think we went further and framed this as part of a settler colonial framing effect. Getting part of the window dressing and the performative language social workers. So social work as a profession so often uses, and they're doing it so beautifully right now.
And that brings us to a good place to pause this first part of our conversation. Over the past hour, we've explored how anti-Palestinian, anti-Arab, and anti-Muslim racisms operate across structural, institutional, and interpersonal levels, and how social work, despite its professed values, has too often met this moment with silence or symbolic action. My guests have helped us name that silence for what it is, which is complicity rooted in histories of colonialism and selective empathy that continues to shape our profession today. In our next episode, we'll pick up right here and dive even deeper. We'll examine what it means to respond to calls for quote-unquote neutrality and dissenting views within social work, and we'll bring this issue back to the level of the clients and communities that we serve every day as social workers, with special attention to how these forms of racism impact youth. Finally, we'll close with a collective call to action for our profession. How can we, as social workers, move beyond statements toward real solidarity and transformation? Once again, I want to thank Professor Sahar Aziz and the Rutgers Center for Security, Race, and Rights for hosting this important conversation and for their ongoing work advancing justice for marginalized communities.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode of the Race and Rights podcast. This podcast is hosted by the Center for Security, Race, and Rights, housed at Rutgers Law School, also known as the People's Electric Law School. CSRR engages in research, education, and advocacy on issues that adversely impact the civil and human rights of America's diverse Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities. We do so through an interfaith, cross-racial, and interdisciplinary approach. To hear additional episodes of the Race and Rights podcast, check out our pages on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, and everywhere else podcasts are available. Now, for a deep dive on these issues, visit our website at csrr.rutgers.edu, where you can find policy reports, teach-ins, and news commentary by our over 130 faculty affiliates. To watch our over 80 academic and public policy lectures, subscribe to our YouTube channel at Rutgers Center for Security, Race, and Rights. And on social media, be sure to follow us on Instagram at Rutgers CSRR and on Twitter and Facebook at RUCSRR. Finally, you can financially support the Center for Security, Race, and Rights by going to our website at csrr.rutgers.edu and press the donate button. And please give generously. As always, be well and see you next time.